They say queens were pampered, protected, delicate flowers living in perfumed chambers with servants tending to their every whim. The truth? Being a queen meant being property with a crown, a breeding vessel wrapped in silk, expected to produce heirs while slowly dying from the inside out. It meant swallowing poison disguised as medicine, enduring treatments that were barely disguised torture, and knowing that the moment your womb failed, you became expendable. This wasn't fairy tale royalty. This was survival in a gilded cage, where the bars were made of protocol, the locks were tradition, and the key was held by men who saw you as livestock with a pedigree. Let's talk about what really happened behind those castle walls, in those private chambers where history prefers not to look too closely. When a young girl, sometimes barely 13 years old, was married off to secure an alliance, she wasn't just gaining a husband. She was inheriting a death sentence with installment payments. The wedding night wasn't romance. It was a public spectacle where witnesses sometimes waited outside the chamber, or worse, remained inside to verify consummation. Sheets were inspected for blood, discussed, analyzed, preserved as proof that the transaction had been completed. The girl's pain, her fear, her humiliation, none of that mattered. She was a political instrument, and the first test was whether she could bleed on command. But the real horror started when she became pregnant. Royal physicians, men who had never experienced menstruation, never carried a child, never felt labor pains, decided they knew exactly what a queen's body needed. They prescribed treatments based on ancient texts written by other men who knew even less. Bloodletting during pregnancy was standard practice. They believed a woman's body became overheated when carrying a child, that excess blood needed to be drained to maintain balance. So physicians would open veins in the queen's arm, sometimes taking pints of blood while she was already weak, already struggling with the physical demands of pregnancy. They did this monthly, sometimes weekly, convinced they were helping even as they watched her grow paler, more exhausted, more fragile. The tonics were worse. Queens were fed concoctions that would make a modern toxicologist scream. Mercury was considered purifying, so pregnant queens swallowed pills containing liquid metal, small doses that accumulated in their systems, causing tremors, tooth loss, personality changes, and kidney failure. They were given preparations containing lead, which physicians believed strengthened the womb. It didn't strengthen anything. It poisoned the mother and the developing child, leading to stillbirths, miscarriages, and babies born with defects that medieval doctors blamed on the mother as moral failings, rather than their own deadly prescriptions. When labor began, the torture intensified. Queens gave birth in rooms sealed tight, windows covered, doors shut, fires blazing regardless of the season. Physicians believed fresh air was dangerous during childbirth, that it carried evil humors that could harm mother and child. So women labored in sweltering, airless chambers, struggling to breathe while their bodies tried to push new life into the world. They were forbidden from crying out too loudly, told that excessive screaming indicated weak character, that a true queen suffered with dignity. Some bit through wooden rods placed between their teeth, fracturing their own jaws, rather than violate this expectation of silent agony. The birthing chair itself was an instrument of control. Queens were strapped into seated positions, their legs forced apart and secured, unable to move, unable to shift, unable to find any position that might ease the pain. Male physicians, who had never witnessed a normal birth, who learned their craft from books rather than experience, would reach inside with unwashed hands, checking dilation, manipulating the child's position, introducing bacteria from previous patients, from their own daily activities, from corpses they had dissected hours earlier. They didn't know about infection. They didn't understand that their hands were weapons. When complications arose, when the baby wouldn't come, when the mother had been laboring for days, the physicians made decisions. They had hooks, frightening metal instruments designed to extract a stuck child piece by piece if necessary. They would puncture the infant's skull inside the womb, collapse it, pull it out in fragments, all while the mother remained conscious, feeling everything, knowing her child was being destroyed inside her body. Sometimes they saved the mother this way. Sometimes they killed them both. And if the mother survived, but the baby died, she was blamed. Weak womb, insufficient faith, punishment from God, never the physician's filthy hands, never the mercury she had been fed for months, never the deliberate starvation some doctors prescribed, believing a thin mother would have an easier birth. Queens who survived childbirth faced the lying-in period, weeks of mandatory bed rest in those same sealed, suffocating rooms. They weren't allowed to stand, to walk, to expose themselves to light or air. They lay in beds soaked with lochia, the heavy bleeding that follows birth, while physicians insisted changing the linens too frequently would disturb the healing process. They developed infections and wounds that could have been prevented with basic hygiene. They felt their bodies failing, fever rising, and were told it was normal, natural, part of becoming a mother. The ones who survived repeated pregnancies, who managed to produce the required heir and spare, discovered that their ordeal had only just begun, because a queen who could no longer bear children became a different kind of problem. She was still expected to share her husband's bed, to perform wifely duties, but now without the justification of producing heirs. Kings took mistresses openly, fathering bastards who received more affection than legitimate children, and queens were expected to pretend not to notice. Some queens were set aside entirely, declared invalid through annulments based on the flimsiest pretenses. Others were accused of adultery, of witchcraft, of treason, convenient charges that appeared whenever a king tired of his wife and wanted a younger replacement. But let's discuss the medical treatments queens endured even when they weren't pregnant, the routine procedures that were supposed to maintain their health and beauty. Royal physicians believed the womb was a wandering organ, literally capable of moving around inside a woman's body, causing hysteria, madness, and physical illness. When a queen displayed any behavior deemed inappropriate, sadness, anger, independence, too much laughter, anything outside the narrow range of acceptable feminine emotion, the diagnosis was obvious. Wandering womb. The treatment was horrifying. They fumigated the vagina with burning herbs, believing strong smells would drive the womb back into position. Queens were forced to inhale smoke from one end, while smoke was blown into them from the other, trapped between two sources of choking fumes, told to remain still while they coughed and gagged. If that didn't work, physicians inserted pessaries soaked in substances meant to be therapeutic, but were actually caustic. Vinegar, bile, compounds containing arsenic, all inserted into sensitive tissue, causing burns, ulcers, infections. The pain was excruciating, but complaining only confirmed the diagnosis. A woman who protested too much clearly had a severe case of hysteria and needed more aggressive treatment. Menstruation itself was considered pathological, a disease requiring management. Queens who had heavy periods were bled additionally, because obviously the solution to losing too much blood was to lose more blood intentionally. Those with painful cramps were given opium preparations that helped with pain but caused severe constipation, which was then treated with violent purgatives that left them weak and dehydrated. The cycle was endless. Treat one symptom, create three more. Treat those, cause new complications, blame the patient's inherent female weakness for all of it. And the beauty treatments were their own special nightmare. Queens were expected to maintain flawless complexions despite the stress, the pregnancies, the bloodletting, the poisonous medications. So they applied makeup that was literally killing them. White lead paste for pale skin, the ideal of beauty, applied daily, absorbed through the skin, accumulating in their systems. Mercury for rouge, giving that sought-after rosy glow while destroying their nervous systems. Belladonna drops in the eyes to dilate pupils, creating a wide-eyed, doll-like appearance while causing blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and eventual blindness. Some queens plucked their hairlines back to create the fashionable high forehead, repeatedly traumatizing follicles until hair stopped growing entirely. Others used caustic mixtures to remove body hair, burning their skin in the process. They wore corsets laced so tightly they couldn't breathe properly, compressing organs, causing fainting spells that were considered charmingly feminine. They balanced wire frameworks on their heads, supporting elaborate hairstyles that weighed pounds, giving them chronic neck pain and headaches. They wore platform shoes that made walking treacherous, leading to falls, broken bones, twisted ankles. All of this was mandatory, expected, enforced by social pressure so intense that refusing meant being labeled unfeminine, unsuitable, a failure as a queen. But perhaps the darkest aspect of queenly existence was the complete lack of privacy, a total absence of bodily autonomy. A queen's menstrual cycle was tracked by servants, by physicians, by her husband's advisors. Everyone had an opinion about her womb's productivity. When she bathed, servants watched, supposedly to assist, but really to observe, to report, to ensure she wasn't doing anything inappropriate. When she used the privy, often just a chair with a hole in it emptying into a chamber pot, servants were present. Her urine and feces were examined by physicians who believed they could diagnose illness from color, smell, consistency. Nothing was private. Nothing was hers. Queens who showed signs of mental illness, depression from isolation, anxiety from constant surveillance, were subjected to treatments that would be called torture by any modern standard. They were restrained, sometimes for days, to prevent them from harming themselves or others. They were dunked in ice-cold water to shock them back to sanity. They were spun in chairs until they vomited, a treatment called rotational therapy that was supposed to rebalance the brain's humors. They were kept in darkened rooms, deprived of human contact, fed minimal rations, all meant to cure them, but really just breaking them down further. And if a queen became truly inconvenient, if she couldn't produce heirs, couldn't maintain the image, couldn't keep pretending that everything was wonderful in her golden prison, she could simply disappear. Sent to a convent for her health, confined to remote estates for her own protection, declared mentally unfit and kept locked away while her husband ruled on without her. Some queens spent decades in these comfortable prisons, alive but erased, their names barely remembered, their suffering completely forgotten. So here is the question nobody wants to ask. Were queens of medieval and early modern Europe actually privileged, or were they just well-dressed prisoners whose torture was refined enough to be called medicine? Drop your thoughts below. And remember, the next time you see a historical drama showing a queen in her beautiful gown, smiling at her coronation, think about the lead paste on her face, the mercury in her system, the physicians waiting to bleed her, the husband who sees her as a womb with a crown, and the lifetime of medicalized torture disguised as royal care. That was the reality behind the jewels.